It began on a winter morning in 1982, when the convent's bell failed to ring for the first time in nearly a century. Sister Mary Agnes, Sister Catherine Rose, Sister Helena, and Sister Beatrice had retired the previous night after evening prayers, their laughter echoing softly through stone corridors scented with frankincense. By dawn they were gone, rooms undisturbed, habits neatly folded on narrow cots, rosaries tangled together atop a single open Bible. The authorities scoured every trail, drained nearby ponds, even excavated an abandoned mine, but not a footprint, thread, or whisper of their fate surfaced. In the small farming valley they had served, fear seeped into faith like ink spilling across a page. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, and soon the mystery settled over the town like a permanent frost. Parishioners lit candles and recited novenas, yet each plea seemed to vanish into the rafters. Stories sprouted in hushed corners of the market, talk of an unmarked van on the old timber road, tales of a stranger seeking shelter from the snow, superstitions about spirits displeased with the sisters' charity for migrant workers. Despite whispers, life pressed on. Weddings were celebrated, children baptized, crops planted and harvested, while 4 empty pews remained untouched, a silent accusation trembling against every homily. 30 years rolled by, carving deep lines into familiar faces and rust into barn roofs. Then, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Jacob Miller, a third-generation dairy farmer, pried open the warped doors of his grandfather's long-sealed storage shed. Sunlight sliced through decades of dust, illuminating forgotten tools and mildewed saddlebags. As Jacob reached to unhook an old lantern, his boot struck a loose floorboard, which splintered, revealing a hidden compartment. And inside, something wrapped in faded linen, bound with a rosary whose beads glimmered in unsettling crimson. Word of the discovery rippled through the valley faster than any sermon. Neighbors abandoned supper pots to gather beneath Jacob's loft window, their breaths pluming in the chill as sheriff's deputies cordoned off the property. Reporters descended within hours, resurfacing memories the community had folded away like funeral garments. Some swore the sisters had returned at last, cloaked in mystery rather than wool. Others feared the worst, that whatever haunted the night of their disappearance had been lurking under their very feet all along. Yet none were prepared for the revelations sealed inside that linen bundle. Revelations capable of unraveling 3 decades of speculation and exposing a truth more astonishing and more terrifying than the valley's darkest folklore. Tonight, we reopen the case, retracing the final steps of 4 devoted women and the shocking chain of events ignited by one farmer's accidental discovery. Stay with us, for what you are about to witness may forever alter the line between faith and fear and challenge everything a quiet town thought it believed about miracles, secrets, and the cost of silence. Jacob Miller had never believed in ghosts. A man of soil and sweat, he had inherited his father's quiet skepticism along with the family farm. So when he felt that peculiar hollow knock beneath the barn floor that afternoon, his first thought wasn't of mystery or miracles, but of mice. Curious, he cleared aside the hay and pried up the loose board. What he found instead stopped his breath cold. A linen-wrapped bundle, knotted with a rosary unlike any he'd ever seen. Its cross was bent, the metal dulled with age, but the beads shimmered unnaturally, catching the light in blood-red pulses. Inside the bundle were items too pristine for time to have spared. A wooden cross carved delicately with the initials SCR, a collection of brittle letters addressed to Mother Superior, and a single photograph, untouched by decay. The image depicted the 4 nuns in front of the convent chapel, their faces serene, each holding a sunflower. The strangest part? On the back of the photo, scribbled in faint pencil, was a date, March 11th, 1993. 11 years after they had vanished. The sheriff was called. Deputies arrived within the hour, their boots crunching through the dry leaves as they entered the barn. Crime scene tape went up, and questions began to fall like rain. Where had the items come from? Why were they hidden in Jacob's barn? Most chilling of all, why did everything inside look barely touched by time? And what was the meaning behind the photo's impossible timestamp? Word spread quickly. Soon, the oldest residents began speaking again of the nuns. of Sister Mary Agnes, who used to sing lullabies to children in the orphanage courtyard, of Sister Helena, who once prayed for a dying boy all night, and, some say, brought him back from the brink. Their memories were tender, reverent, but also tinged with fear, because the sisters had not simply disappeared. They had vanished together, in silence, leaving no trace, no struggle, no goodbye. The discovery reawakened something in the town, a tremble, an ache. But beneath the surface of remembrance, darker questions stirred, about what had been hidden, who had hidden it, and why the truth had remained buried beneath a barn floor for 30 years. The photograph was just the beginning. What it led to would unravel the very soul of the valley. The following day, the contents of the bundle were transferred to the sheriff's office, where forensic analysts were brought in from the state capitol. Jacob, though deeply shaken, agreed to a full search of his property. The barn was emptied piece by piece, hidden compartments discovered beneath the grain bins, scratches in the wall that hadn't been there the week before, and then, beneath a layer of loose stone in the farthest corner, an iron box. It was small, heavy, and locked tight with a rusted latch. When the sheriff finally forced it open, silence fell over the room. Inside was a journal, a nun's journal, dated from January to June of 1982. The final entry was dated 2 days before their disappearance. The handwriting was hurried, erratic, pages filled with prayers, warnings, and repeated words that sent a chill down the spine of every officer present. He is here. We opened the door. We shouldn't have. The journal revealed a story no one expected. The sisters had been caring for a man, unlisted in any convent ledger, unnamed in official records. He had arrived late one night during a storm, wrapped in a wool coat soaked with blood. They had taken him in, as was their vow. But from the first night, strange occurrences began, candles extinguishing themselves, chapel bells ringing at odd hours, whispers in empty halls. Sister Catherine Rose had written the most. Her passages grew more desperate, more fragmented. She wrote of nightmares, of voices speaking Latin in her dreams, of dark symbols appearing on the chapel walls. One entry read, "He is not a man. He wears one, but he is not one. We are being tested, or we are being punished." Her final line, underlined 3 times, read simply, "Do not trust the one who prays without a shadow." Authorities dismissed it as hysteria, religious delusion brought on by stress or illness. But the locals, especially the elderly, did not. They spoke of old stories, of spirits that dwell in places of worship too long forgotten, of oaths that, once broken, invite things that cannot be uninvited. What the nuns had brought into the convent in 1982 was not just a man seeking refuge. It was something older, something watching. And now, it had been stirred again. While the sheriff and his team continued to sift through the evidence, Father Tomas, the town's parish priest for over 2 decades, requested to see the journal. He had served under the same order as the 4 sisters and had once studied theology alongside Sister Beatrice in seminary. When he read the entries, his hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from recognition. The phrases in Latin, the symbols described, they weren't random. They belonged to an ancient text forbidden by the Church centuries ago, Liber Tenebris, the Book of Shadows. Few copies were said to exist. Most were destroyed by the Vatican during the Great Cleansing of 1600, but scattered references remained in lost monastic writings, warnings about doors that should never be opened. Father Tomas explained that what the sisters had encountered might not have been a man, but a vessel, something possessed, something ancient. And if the entries were real, the nuns hadn't vanished. They had sacrificed themselves to contain it. A historian was brought in from the diocesan archives, and she verified what no one wanted to believe. The convent had been built on the foundation of a pagan ritual site, a site known for blood offerings, sealed by missionaries who believed their faith would be strong enough to suppress whatever lingered there. But faith, as it turned out, was not the same as silence. And silence, in time, decays. Even more disturbing, hidden within the binding of the journal, folded like a secret never meant to be read, was a letter addressed to the next one who finds this. It was unsigned, but clearly written by one of the sisters. The letter warned of symbols etched into the convent cellar door. It begged that no one attempt to break the seal beneath the floorboards, and that if the journal was found, Do not seek the altar. Do not return to the chapel at night. Burn this, and pray. But the letter had not been burned, and the chapel still stood, abandoned, its windows shattered, its doors chained shut since 1992 when lightning struck its bell tower, starting a fire that miraculously extinguished itself within minutes. Locals had always called it divine intervention. Now, some began to wonder, had it been something else entirely? A warning? A final act of containment? Driven by a sense of duty? Or perhaps something deeper, something instinctual? Father Tomas gathered a small group of trusted parishioners and approached the diocesan office with a request to reopen the chapel. His proposal was met with resistance. Let the past rest, they said. Don't provoke what's been buried. But Tomas insisted. He had read too much, seen too much, and he feared what might awaken if they chose to ignore the signs. Reluctantly, permission was granted. On the eve of the autumn solstice, the chapel doors were unsealed. Dust fell like ash from the rafters. The altar, once adorned with lilies and lace, now sat cracked and crooked beneath a collapsed beam. The scent inside was thick, candle wax, mildew, and something else. Something sharp, metallic, like blood long dried. The team moved carefully, guided by the map drawn in the Nuns' journal. It led to the cellar beneath the chapel, the place where the man had been hidden or imprisoned. As they lifted the old trapdoor, a rush of freezing air exploded upward. Father Tomas whispered a prayer, his voice trembling as they descended the narrow stairs. The walls were covered in scripture, written not in paint, but in ash, symbols that pulsed when the flashlight beam passed over them. At the far end of the cellar was a stone door, etched with carvings identical to those described by Sister Catherine Rose. And at the center of it, the cross from the rosary Jacob had found, embedded in the stone like a key. No one spoke, not even Tomas. It was clear that what lay beyond the door was never meant to be seen again. But curiosity is a powerful thing, especially when mingled with purpose. As the priest stepped forward to examine the carvings, the air grew heavier, thicker. Each breath felt like pulling smoke through the lungs. And then, the door groaned. No one had touched it. No one had moved. But the stone shifted inward, dust spiraling upward like a whisper breaking free. What they saw beyond that threshold would never be spoken of publicly again. Not because they were sworn to silence, but because no one knew how to explain it. Not in any language born of this world. What lay beyond the stone door was not a room, but a chamber, round, deep, and ancient. The walls were smooth, carved from black stone, unlike anything else in the chapel's foundation. It was colder here, unnaturally so, and the air had a hum, low, constant, like a whisper buried beneath silence. In the center of the chamber stood an altar, not of wood or marble, but of bone. Real, human, arranged with surgical precision, woven with strands of what looked like hair, and encircled by dried petals that had not crumbled, despite the passing of time. Father Tomas dropped to his knees, not in prayer, but in shock. The others stood frozen. No one spoke. The space demanded reverence, or perhaps fear. On the far side of the chamber, a symbol had been carved into the floor, a circle split by 3 lines, bleeding outward like a sun turned inward. It matched the one found in Sister Catherine Rose's final drawing. And at the center of it lay a single object, a small wooden box, untouched by dust, untouched by time. As Tomas stepped forward to examine the box, the lights flickered. The room fell into total blackness for exactly 3 seconds. When his flashlight returned, the others had backed away. The temperature had dropped by several degrees, and the box had moved, only slightly, but enough that no one could deny what they just witnessed. The priest bent slowly, reached out, and opened it. Inside, there was no treasure, no relic, just pages, torn, stained, each one filled with what appeared to be the same sentence, written over and over in different hands, in different languages, spanning decades, centuries even. Do not listen when it speaks. Some were written in Latin, others in Aramaic, a few in scripts so old, even the historian with them could not identify the characters. Then a noise. Not from the chamber, from above. The chapel, the bell, ringing. The same bell that had been cracked and silent for over 30 years. Each toll, echoed through the chamber like a scream held underwater. They rushed to the staircase. But Father Tomas lingered for just a moment longer, staring at the pages, his lips moving silently, as though trying to understand. But when he looked up, his eyes were no longer his own. When the group emerged from the cellar, the chapel had changed. The air was heavier, the light from the stained glass windows darker, as though the colors had bled into the shadows. The bell had stopped ringing, but the sound of it still clung to the rafters. One of the younger parishioners, a man named Luis, turned to Father Tomas and froze. "Father, your eyes," he whispered. Everyone turned. They were black, not clouded, not injured, black, like ink poured into glass. Father Tomas blinked slowly, and for a moment, his voice was not his own. It was layered, his tone overlapping with something deeper, something older. He murmured a phrase in Latin none of them understood, then collapsed. When he awoke moments later, his eyes had returned to normal. But he remembered nothing. That night, no one spoke a word about what had happened. The chapel was resealed. The sheriff's report filed under abnormal structural discovery. But privately, the group gathered again, shaken, confused, and carrying the heavy weight of a truth that didn't fit into the laws of science or scripture. Luis left town within days. The historian returned to the capital and resigned from her post. And Tomas, he began writing again, only in Latin, only at night. Meanwhile, Jacob Miller, the farmer, returned to his land. But he could not sleep. The barn now stood empty, the floor repaired. Yet some nights, the rosary he had found, now locked in a drawer, would rattle against the wood, softly, as if moved by wind or by memory. He began having dreams, dreams of nuns walking through his fields, their faces covered, their hands bleeding, and behind them, the man with no shadow. The town returned to normal, at least on the surface. Services resumed, markets reopened, laughter returned to the schoolyard. But beneath it all, something had shifted, something had awakened. The barn, the chapel, the cellar, they were no longer places of silence. They were thresholds, and whatever had stirred behind that stone door was not finished. Not yet. 3 months passed. The town, eager to forget, allowed the story to fade into folklore. But for those who had entered the chamber, forgetting was impossible. Father Tomas had changed. His sermons became darker, less about grace, more about punishment. He spoke of gates, of eyes that never close, of voices that whisper from beneath the earth. Some parishioners found it poetic. Others left the church entirely. But those who had seen the journal, the cellar, the altar, they recognized something else. He was unraveling. One evening, he was found kneeling alone in the chapel, the doors inexplicably unchained, candlelight flickering in a spiral around him. On the walls, someone, or something, had written in ash the same words from the box. "Do not listen when it speaks." The sheriff tried to intervene, but when they touched Tomas, he convulsed violently, then screamed in a voice that did not belong to him. It took 3 men to hold him down. When he awoke, he wept like a child and begged them to board the chapel shut. This time, permanently. The sheriff agreed. Nails were driven through the doors. Iron bars welded across the windows. A sign posted, "Condemned for structural instability." But everyone knew that wasn't the reason. The church had simply become a wound, too deep, too infected to heal. And as winter set in, the dreams returned. First for Jacob, then for others. Dreams of chanting, of soil soaked in blood, of a woman crying in the woods, holding a book wrapped in linen. Then, without explanation, animals began avoiding the barn. Birds no longer perched on its roof. Dogs whimpered when brought near. And every so often, just before dawn, a light would flicker behind its windows, brief, pale, like a match struck in the dark. Jacob tried to ignore it. He tried prayer. He tried burning sage. But one night, when he opened his eyes and saw a figure standing at the foot of his bed, clutching a sunflower dripping red, he knew. The story wasn't finished. It was calling someone back. Jacob couldn't keep it to himself anymore. He returned to Father Tomas, who had since secluded himself in the rectory, refusing visitors, eating little, and speaking less. But when Jacob knocked and whispered through the door, "She's in the barn again," there was silence. Then the creak of footsteps. The door opened, and behind it stood not the priest Jacob remembered, but a gaunt, hollow-eyed man, trembling from within. "She never left," Tomas said. "She's waiting." Together, they returned to the barn. Inside it was freezing. The air hung heavy, unmoving, and on the far wall, carved freshly into the wood, were the initials of all 4 nuns. Beneath them, written in looping script, a phrase neither man recognized. Later, the historian, now working independently from the church, would identify it as Old Galilean Aramaic. Its meaning, "We were the price." Jacob uncovered the old floorboards again, the same ones he pried up months earlier. This time, beneath them, instead of the linen bundle, there was a hole, dug deep into the earth, perfectly circular. The soil around it was black, wet breathing. They lowered a flashlight, but its beam barely touched the bottom. Something absorbed the light, devoured it. The following day, the historian returned. She brought with her documents the diocese had tried to suppress: maps, censored journals, warnings from monks dating back to the 11th century. The symbol from the cellar, 3 lines within a circle, appeared in every one, each tied to a site of mass disappearance, each tied to the same ritual, each marked by the presence of 4 figures, always female, always silent, always vanishing without a trace. And so, the horrifying conclusion began to form. The nuns had not been victims, nor martyrs. They were guardians, chosen, or perhaps cursed, to hold something back, to keep the door closed. Their disappearance wasn't the end of the story. It was the seal, and Jacob's discovery had broken it. The historian, Dr. Evelyn Harrow, warned them to stop. "If the well beneath that barn is truly a threshold," she said, "then we're not talking about superstition anymore. We're talking about containment, ritual architecture, a structure built not to shelter, but to imprison." Her voice trembled, not from doubt, but from certainty. She had seen those markings before, in lost catacombs beneath the Vatican, in pages of scripture deemed too dangerous to translate. Jacob wanted to reseal the floor, to bury it again, but Evelyn stopped him. If something was released, it cannot be unreleased. Sealing the door doesn't erase what's already stepped through it. She paused, and the fact that it's quiet now doesn't mean it's gone. They needed answers. They needed to understand what the sisters had done, and why the echoes of that act still resonated through time. The journal had hinted at a ritual, one that required silence, sacrifice, and devotion unshaken even by terror. Evelyn suggested they revisit the last known location of the sisters before they vanished. An isolated clearing deep in the woods, marked on an old hand-drawn map found in the Nuns' Bible. That evening, with dusk falling like a veil, Jacob, Evelyn, and Father Tomas set out, armed with lanterns, holy water, and pages from the journal. The path was overgrown, almost as if nature itself had tried to erase the way. When they reached the clearing, it was exactly as the journal described, a perfect circle of dead grass, with 4 stone pillars standing at the cardinal points. In the center, a scorched circle of earth, untouched by wind or rain. It felt wrong. The silence was not peaceful, but suffocating. And then Evelyn noticed something carved into the stones, again in Old Aramaic. 4 names. The sisters. Beneath each name, a date. But one of the dates had not yet come. Jacob stared at it. "That's next week." A chill passed through all of them. If the last ritual had been about sealing, then what was the next one for? And who would it claim? That night, Evelyn locked herself in her guest room and spread out every document she had gathered. Her hands trembled as she pieced together the timeline. The sisters' arrival, the arrival of the injured man, the disturbances, the journal entries, the storm. But then she saw it, something she had missed before. In one of Sister Helena's final letters, she had written, "We are 4, because it must always be 4. 4 corners, 4 voices, 4 hearts to hold back what is no name." Evelyn froze. For it wasn't a coincidence. It was a requirement, a rule, a law tied to something older than Scripture. The sisters had not disappeared. They had performed a ritual, one that used their very presence as the lock. And when they vanished, they weren't taken. They had gone willingly, each of them a pillar and a seal that held something ancient beneath the soil. Which meant, if the seal had been broken, A new one would be needed. A new 4. The question clawed at her mind. Was it too late? Had the breaking already occurred? Or was it only beginning? And most terrifying of all, was it possible that someone or something was already choosing the next 4? Meanwhile, Jacob began noticing small things on his property. Flowers, sunflowers, sprouting in rows he hadn't planted. 4 in a line. Always 4. Candles relighting themselves after being blown out. The rosary in his drawer appearing on the windowsill without explanation. And dreams worsening. He saw the sisters again, their faces now blurred. They weren't walking anymore. They were waiting. Father Tomas called an emergency meeting at the rectory. Only those who had entered the cellar were invited. He stood before them, eyes sunken, holding the final page from the nun's journal. The ritual is incomplete, he said, and the ground beneath us remembers. It remembers what it held, and what it lost. And outside, beyond the window pane, the chapel bell rang once. Without wind, without motion, without mercy. The sound of the bell paralyzed the room. No one moved. No one breathed. The chapel had been sealed for months. There was no rope, no mechanism left intact. Yet the bell had rung, and everyone in that room knew what it meant. Jacob stood first. "We can't keep pretending we don't know," he said, his voice low but steady. "This thing, whatever it is, it's choosing, and it's watching." Evelyn laid out the pattern. Each appearance, each symbol, each sound, all aligning toward a single date, the one carved beneath the 4th name in the woods. A date just 5 days away. "I think this is a countdown," she said. "And if we don't understand the ritual in time, it may choose 4 people again. But this time not nuns. This time, anyone. Us." Her voice cracked. Or worse, someone completely innocent. The group was silent, until Tomas stepped forward and placed a single object on the table. A key. "This is from the diocese's vault," he said. "I shouldn't have it. But it opened a room no one has entered in decades. The sisters left something there before they vanished. Something sealed under the name of Mother Superior. I believe it's time we opened it." The vault was deep beneath the parish's original rectory, now abandoned and swallowed by ivy. As they descended into the damp corridor, the air grew colder with every step. The door was iron, engraved with 4 crosses. When the key turned, the hinges groaned like a dying breath. The room inside was small, lined with books and holy relics, but in the center sat a single chest, carved in oak, bound in rope, and branded with the same sunsplit symbol that marked the stones in the clearing. They opened it. Inside, beneath cloth worn soft by time, were 4 habits, clean, folded, and unblemished. And tucked between them, a 5th item, a white veil. Brand new, unworn, still waiting. Evelyn reached for the veil, her hands shaking. "This isn't just a symbol," she whispered. "This is preparation." They knew this would happen again. They planned for it. Folded beneath the fabric was a letter, signed by Sister Beatrice. It was addressed to the ones who wake the seal. The letter spoke of a cycle, of a darkness that cannot be destroyed, only restrained, of the 4 who would be needed whenever the seal began to loosen. What haunted them most was the phrasing, "You must not wait to be chosen. You must choose yourselves." It wasn't just a warning. It was an invitation, a demand, a plea to those who had disturbed what was sleeping, that they now had a responsibility to restore the balance. But what if they didn't? What if no one stepped forward? That night, each of them returned home changed. Evelyn lit a candle in front of her grandmother's rosary and wept. Jacob sat in the barn until morning, watching the shadows twist and stretch in corners that no longer obeyed the laws of light. And Tomas locked himself inside the church and prayed without words. None of them spoke about the veil. None of them asked the question aloud, but it echoed in every heartbeat. Would I give my life to save others? Would I vanish so the world could sleep again? 2 nights later, Luis, the young parishioner who had first helped reopen the chapel, was found wandering outside town. His hands were covered in ash. He had no memory of how he got there, but repeated one phrase over and over. "She's calling us." The 4th hasn't been chosen. The group reunited one final time, not with confidence, not with certainty, but with resolve. If no one else would stand between this world and what stirred beneath it, then maybe they were the ones meant to do so. The ones who had seen, who had entered, who had listened, but refused to let the darkness finish what it had started. The air was brittle that morning, as if the very wind held its breath. Evelyn gathered her research, the journal, the letters, and the veil, placing them carefully into a wooden case. She no longer saw herself as an outsider documenting a mystery. She was now a thread woven into it. Meanwhile, Jacob prepared the barn. Salt lines, iron nails, prayers carved into the beams. Not out of superstition, but out of a deeper knowing. Some rituals are older than religion. Father Tomas brought candles blessed by rites long forgotten by the modern church. He wore no collar that day, only silence. They met in the chapel shadow, the chains now rusted, the boards rotting. Evelyn opened her notebook. "The fourth hasn't been chosen," she whispered. "But it doesn't mean we have to wait for a sacrifice. Maybe the seal doesn't need 4 deaths. Maybe it needs 4 witnesses. For people willing to remember." Tomas looked to the veil. "Then we bear the memory, and we hold it so others don't have to." The 3 of them entered the barn together, their footsteps echoing over the reinforced floor. The hatch was already open. The soil beneath, black and breathing, pulsed like a second heart. Evelyn laid the veil beside the pit. Jacob lit the circle of candles. Tomas began the prayer, not in Latin, but in the words written in the sister's final letter, an ancient plea for stillness. As their voices joined, the air changed. The barn darkened, not by cloud, but by presence. The candles flared high, then flickered low. A wind moved upward from the earth, not angry, but curious, testing, listening. And from the pit came a sound, not a growl, nor a voice, but something in between, something that did not belong to this world, but had never truly left it. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the wind stopped. The ground settled. The candles stilled. The barn was silent again. And in the center of the floor, where nothing had been placed, now rested a 5th habit. Smaller, child-sized, folded neatly, waiting. None of them spoke. The sight of the child-sized habit sat like a stone in the center of their chests. Evelyn felt her knees weaken. "It's not finished," she whispered. "It's evolving." Tomas lowered his gaze. "It doesn't want 4 women anymore. It wants a lineage, a renewal, a new generation of guardians, or sacrifices." Jacob turned and bolted from the barn, heart pounding. His daughter, Anna, had been waking in the night, dreaming of nuns with hollow eyes and fields full of sunflowers. She'd begun drawing symbols she'd never been taught, crying without knowing why. He burst in her room, but she was safe, asleep, clutching her rosary, the one she said the nice lady in white had given her. The next morning, Evelyn packed her car. "We need to disappear," she told Tomas. "All of us. Scatter. Keep moving. The seal isn't just physical. It's spiritual. Maybe if we separate, it loses strength." Tomas didn't answer immediately. He stared at the horizon. "No, running doesn't end this. It only delays what's coming." He paused. "We started this by waking something ancient. Now we stay awake, because the moment we go blind to it again, it will finish what it began." Jacob agreed. He left the barn exactly as it was, open, untouched, not because he'd given up, but because he understood. The story couldn't be buried. Not again. Not ever. What they now carried wasn't just knowledge. It was responsibility. To witness. To remember. To protect. And so, they went their separate ways. 3 people. Changed forever. Tied by a secret deeper than language, older than prayer. None of them knew if their efforts had truly restored the seal. But each of them knew this. Whatever lived beneath that barn now knew their names. Weeks passed. At first, the town was calm. The barn remained untouched, the chapel sealed again with iron. Father Tomas resumed Sunday services, though his sermons grew quieter, almost cryptic. Evelyn continued her research from a remote cottage near the mountains, sending Jacob-coded letters every few days. The storm, it seemed, had passed, but survivors of storms know better. The silence that follows is never peace. It's pause. Then, it began again. Subtle. The animals avoided the barn once more. Lights flickered in Jacob's house at exactly the same hour each night. 3:13 a.m., Evelyn received an envelope with no postmark. Inside was a child's drawing, for nuns standing beneath a tree, one with no face. And on the tree's trunk, the sun-split symbol. She didn't tell Jacob. Not yet. But the fear returned. Tomas was the first to admit it. We didn't close the gate, he told Evelyn during a brief visit. We only reminded it that we remember. And that may have fed it more than silence ever did. He had started seeing the sisters. Not in dreams, but in mirrors. In reflections. Not as they were, but as they would be now. Aged, disfigured, half here, half gone. Still guarding something. Still waiting for someone to finish the ritual. Jacob's daughter, Anna, changed too. She began sleepwalking, standing at the barn's edge, whispering prayers no one had taught her. One night, he found her at the edge of the well in the forest clearing, barefoot and silent, staring into the void. When he touched her shoulder, she looked up and said, "They said I'm the fifth, the one to remember when you forget." That night, Jacob made a decision. He packed a suitcase, kissed his daughter's forehead, and wrote a single sentence in his journal. "If remembering keeps it asleep, then I'll never forget again." Evelyn, now isolated and haunted by visions of her own, began tracing back the origin of the seal. Not just to the convent, not just to the ritual site, but to a forgotten legend buried in a 14th century French monastic manuscript. The symbol, the pattern of four, the silence, the veil, all pointed to a fragment known only as La Marque du Veilleur, the Watcher's Mark. It wasn't meant to protect against evil. It was meant to warn the world that evil still breathes. And it always begins the same way. For disappear. One returns. But the one who returns isn't whole. It carries memory like infection. It spreads through remembrance, through story, through voice. And when enough people hear it, believe it, it wakes. She realized, too late, what they had done. The journal, the testimonies, the meetings. They hadn't sealed anything. They'd reactivated it. The story had spread through whispers, through suspicion, through fear. The memory hadn't faded. It had multiplied. They weren't the seal. They were the signal. Jacob began seeing more drawings. Anna's sketches turned from gentle sunflowers to black circles, twisted faces, and one recurring image, a barn burning under a sky of eyes. He didn't sleep. He barely ate. And one night, as he watched his daughter hum an old hymn she'd never heard before, he whispered, "It's choosing again, isn't it?" Anna nodded once. It never stopped. Meanwhile, Tomas disappeared. No note. No farewell. Only a folded clerical collar left at the chapel door, and a single Latin phrase carved into the stone above it. Custos factus sum ego. I had become the guardian. Father Tomas's disappearance sent shockwaves through the already fraying group. Evelyn, upon reading the Latin inscription he left behind, broke down. She knew what it meant. He had willingly offered himself as the new seal. Just like the sisters. Just like the four before him. But there had only been one of him. The ritual was clear. It required four. A single life, however sacrificial, wasn't enough to hold back the dark tide, now swelling beneath the surface. Jacob found himself drifting through days like a man underwater. Anna had stopped speaking. She simply stared. At walls. At corners. At places where no one else looked. And when he asked what she saw, she would only say, "She's getting closer." One night, Jacob opened his front door and found a sunflower nailed to the frame. But the petals were gray, dry, as if they had died 100 years ago. Evelyn tried to trace any surviving members of the original convent's order. She drove across counties, visited closed monasteries, read records in candlelit archives. Finally, in a hospice hidden in the hills of Vermont, she found a name, Sister Callista, 97 years old, mute since 1982. When Evelyn showed her the drawing from Anna, the old woman wept. And then, for the first time in 4 decades, she spoke. A single word, again. Through a trembling hand, Callista wrote the rest. You can't kill what waits. You can only keep it dreaming. But the dream needs four. For who do not fear the price. For who will never speak again. Evelyn felt her breath leave her body. That was the real seal. Not death. Not sacrifice. Silence. Absolute, permanent silence. The sisters hadn't vanished. They had willingly erased themselves from the world. But now, the watchers knew too much. The ones who had read, spoken, remembered, they had already disturbed the dream. And the more they tried to fix it, the more the veil tore. On the third night of Father Tomas's disappearance, The barn burned. There were no signs of lightning, no accelerants, no evidence of trespass. But by dawn, only ash remained, all except the foundation stones. And in the center, untouched by flame, stood the fifth habit, still child-sized, still waiting. Jacob stood before the ruins, his daughter clutching his coat, whispering, "Now there's no place for her to hide. She'll come to our house." Evelyn arrived shortly after, her face pale, hollowed by sleeplessness. "The seal's gone," she said flatly. "We're past containment now. This is awakening." She held out a page. "I found this behind Callista's bed." It was a drawing of the well, the altar, the chapel, and something new, a house, drawn in charcoal and fire, labeled Final Host. Jacob looked down at his daughter, who nodded before he could speak. "It's our home." His voice cracked. "It always has been." Evelyn swallowed hard. "Then it's here. It followed the story. And now it's waiting for the last word to be spoken." But none of them knew what that word was. Only that once spoken, the dream would end, and whatever waited would no longer be bound by soil or story. That night, Jacob boarded every window. He placed salt under the doors. He read prayers written in languages he did not understand. But when the clock struck 3:13, all the candles in the house flickered out. And outside, in the cornfield, for silhouettes stood, watching. And Anna, without fear, whispered, "She's not coming for me, Daddy. She's coming for you. You spoke the last word the moment you said yes." Jacob barely slept. He sat in the hallway outside Anna's room, shotgun across his lap, Bible in his hands, but the words blurred before his eyes. Outside, the silhouettes remained. 4 figures, motionless, patient, as if bound to a rule that no longer needed explanation. Evelyn stayed in the guest room, murmuring translations from the pages she'd collected. "There's still a choice," she whispered, more to herself than anyone. "But it's not about who goes. It's about who remembers." At dawn, the silhouettes were gone, but the damage lingered. Walls cracked, mirrors fogged. The house moaned with every breeze. And Anna began humming again, a melody no one taught her, the same one Sister Catherine Rose had written in her final entry. Evelyn recorded it, analyzed it, cross-referenced it with Gregorian chants and pagan lullabies. It matched nothing. It belonged nowhere, because it didn't come from here. By the second night, Jacob stopped pretending he had control. He knelt before Evelyn and begged, "Tell me what to do." But she had no answer. Only a theory. The habit. The fifth. "It's not meant for Anna," she said. "It's meant for you. The memory carrier. The last voice. You spoke into the world, and now want silence." Jacob felt the truth settle like iron in his chest. The dream required 4 who would never speak again. But they had broken that cycle. They had told the story, spread it, shared it. And now, the only way to close it was for someone to step into silence willingly. Not just silence of speech, but a presence, disappearance, removal. That night, Jacob sat beside Anna's bed and told her a story. Not the dark one, not the real one, but a memory. Of her mother's voice, of sunflowers that bloomed every spring, of the time she sang off-key in church and made the whole congregation laugh. Anna smiled, for the first time in weeks, and as she drifted into sleep, she whispered, "Don't forget, Daddy, or it comes back again." At 3:13 a.m., Jacob walked into the center of his field. The ashes from the barn had been carried by the wind and now coated the soil like a thin veil. He carried nothing with him. No weapon, no book, just the fifth habit folded under his arm. He reached the circle where the figures had stood. They weren't there now, but the weight of their absence felt heavier than their presence ever had. He placed the habit on the ground, slowly, deliberately, then knelt and whispered a prayer. Not in Latin, not in any language Evelyn had found in her studies, but one his own, a final word, a final offering, a release. And as the final syllable passed his lips, the wind died. Inside the house, Evelyn awoke with a start. The air had changed. The pressure lifted. For the first time in months, the house was silent. Anna slept peacefully. Outside, the stars returned. Clear. Still. The field was empty. No figures. No Jacob. No habit. Only the soil remained, untouched and undisturbed. Evelyn never found him. Neither did the sheriff. Only a note left behind on his kitchen table. Just 7 words, written in a steady hand. If memory feeds it, I choose silence. Beneath it, a drawing. For sunflowers. And one smaller. Closed. Bowed. And so the story ends. Not with a scream, but with a whisper swallowed by the earth. A man who remembered too much. A child who forgot just enough. And a town that once lost 4 nuns. Only to discover that some vanishings are not tragedies. They are offerings. Evelyn didn't speak at the funeral. There was no body, no coffin. Only a field, a stone with no name, and a small white veil placed gently on top. The town called an accident. A man lost in grief. Some whispered that he'd walked into the woods and never came back. Others said he ran. But Evelyn knew better. She stood in silence as the wind swept across the land, her eyes fixed on the soil where the 5th habit had once been. He didn't run from something, she thought. He ran toward it. Weeks passed. Anna began to smile again. Her drawings returned to normal. No more symbols. No more sunflowers. No more nuns with black eyes. Just skies, birds, and trees. Evelyn stayed close, visiting often, never saying too much. But every night, before she left, she checked the corners of the house, the reflections in the glass, the quiet between the hours. Because even if the seal was whole again, memory has a way of leaking. Then, one morning, Anna brought Evelyn a drawing. "It's Daddy," she said, beaming. Evelyn smiled, until she looked closer. The figure stood in a field, surrounded by 4 others. But his face was empty, a blank space, the way the nuns had been in the final photograph. Evelyn knelt down. "Why did you draw him like this?" Anna thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Because he told me not to remember." Evelyn said nothing. She folded the drawing and placed it gently inside the back of her notebook. That night, she burned every copy of her research. The journal, the symbols, the recordings, all of it. Into the fire it went. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Some truths are not meant to be shared. Not written, not spoken, only carried in silence. Because what Jacob had done wasn't destruction. It was containment. The kind that doesn't rely on locks or walls, but on forgetting. And Evelyn knew now. The story wasn't to be retold. It was to be remembered quietly and guarded forever. Years later, Anna would grow up to become a teacher. She would live a quiet life in the same town, marry a kind man, and raise 2 children of her own. She would plant sunflowers every spring without ever knowing why. She would avoid the barn ruins instinctively and never let her children wander too far into the woods. And sometimes, when the house was silent, she would think of her father, though his voice, over time, would grow quieter. She never told her own children the story. She didn't need to. The silence was enough. It lived in her bones, in the way she prayed without words, in the way she stood a little too still during thunderstorms, in the way she watched mirrors just a moment longer than most people do. Evelyn died peacefully at the age of 81. Her home was found to be meticulously clean, but on her bookshelf, hidden behind layers of dust and old literature, was a sealed envelope. It contained one thing, the final drawing Anna had given her. On the back was a note in Evelyn's handwriting. "If you find this, burn it. If you've already seen it, forget it." But the woman who found it was curious. She didn't burn it. She didn't forget it. She showed it to a friend, who showed it to another, who posted it online. Within days, a discussion began. A story started to resurface. About the convent, the barn, the sisters, a man who vanished, a child who dreamed in symbols. And slowly, the memory began to breathe again. Because stories, like spirits, do not die. They sleep. And when they are named, when they are remembered, they wake. The forum thread began innocently. A user named Beneath the Bell 82 posted an old photo claiming it had been found inside a locked drawer in a church slated for demolition. It showed 4 nuns, faces blurred, standing in front of a field of sunflowers. The caption simply read, "Does anyone recognize this place?" Within hours, the replies flooded in. Some claimed it was fake. Others said it matched the design of convents built in the early 1900s. But one comment stood out. "I live near here. My grandmother used to whisper about the 4 who never came back." From that moment, the story spread like wildfire. True crime channels covered it. Paranormal podcasts dissected it. A viral TikTok recreated the missing bell sound, using AI, which thousands claimed triggered headaches, blackouts, or dreams. Always the same dream: a dark well, a veil, and the sound of humming. None of them knew where it came from, but all of them described it the same way. Anna, now in her 40s, received an email from a former student. "Did you see this? Doesn't it sound like that old story you once mentioned in class?" Her heart froze. She hadn't spoken about the convent, the barn, or her father in decades. She clicked the link, saw the drawing, her own drawing, the one she had given Evelyn when she was just a child. She felt the shift immediately. The air in her house grew heavier. Her ears began to ring faintly. 3 chimes, soft but sharp, like a bell underwater. Her children found her sitting motionless on the couch, eyes wide, holding her phone with white-knuckled grip. "Mom," they asked, but she didn't respond. Not at first. And when she finally turned to them, she asked just one question: "Have you told anyone about the dreams?" They hadn't, but the look in their eyes told her everything she needed to know. The story had returned, and this time, it was choosing for blood. Anna packed that same night. Not clothes, not food, only 3 things: her father's Bible, the one page from Evelyn she had secretly kept, and a small sunflower pendant she hadn't worn since she was 9. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't leave a note. But before she left, she knelt beside her children's beds, placed a kiss on each forehead, and whispered, "Forget me." She drove through the night, arriving at the ruins of the barn just before dawn. The stones still remained, sunken into the earth, moss-covered, forgotten by the world, but not by what lay beneath them. She stepped into the circle. Her feet found the old paths. Her hands traced invisible symbols into the air. She didn't know how she remembered, only that she did. From her coat pocket, she pulled a folded paper, her childhood drawing. The 5 figures in the field. She added a 6th with trembling fingers. A figure with a face this time, her own. And in that moment, the air around her shifted. The silence became alive. And from beneath the soil, the scent of ash and old incense rose, wrapping around her like a shawl. At exactly 3:13 a.m., she placed the pendant into the center of the circle and closed her eyes. She whispered something, not a prayer, not a plea, a vow, one not spoken in words, but in stillness, in surrender. The 5th had chosen silence. Now, so would the 6th. And as the morning sun crested over the distant trees, a breeze passed through the empty field. Light touched the stones again, and for a moment, there were no bells, no whispers, no watchers, just stillness. The dream had returned to sleep. But peace, like silence, is always temporary. 2 weeks after Anna vanished, her children began to speak differently. Not in tone, but in timing. They would pause in odd places, as if listening to someone no one else could hear. They woke up with soil under their nails. The youngest, Lily, was found one night rearranging her bookshelf, not by author or color, but in sets of 4. And when asked why, she simply answered, "So they know where to find me." The father, Mark, tried to hold the family together. He didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or rituals, but he believed in his wife. And when he traced her final route and stood at the ruins of the barn, he knew, without proof, without reason, that something had taken her. Or maybe something had called her. The pendant lay there still, clean, polished, as if waiting to be picked up again. He left it untouched. But later that night, he found it in his daughter's hand. The forums reignited. A new user uploaded an audio clip, recorded near the ruins, of what sounded like 6 voices humming in perfect harmony. No music software could replicate it. No one could trace the file's origin. But those who listened reported the same symptom: recurring dreams of standing at a barn door they could not open, with a voice behind it whispering, "You're next." The veil hadn't been sealed. It had simply changed form. In a small town 300 miles away, a teenage girl named Claire began drawing symbols in her sleep. Her parents thought it was stress, until she started speaking fluent Latin in the middle of the night, something she had never studied. A priest was called. He dismissed it as adolescent dramatics. But when she handed him a folded napkin with 4 names, 3 of them belonging to the original nuns, he left and never returned. Claire had never heard of the convent, never visited the town, but every detail she shared matched the hidden records Evelyn had spent a lifetime decoding. She spoke of a chapel with no doors, a staircase beneath a well, and a hymn that, once finished, could undo the dark. She even drew a woman kneeling in a field of sunflowers. Anna. Researchers labeled it mass psychogenic illness. Paranormal fanatics declared it a reawakening. But the truth was neither, or both. The memory had spread beyond geography, beyond blood. It had taken root in dream, in fear, in imagination. And what had once needed 4 silent souls now needed only belief. Because if stories awaken what's hidden, then retelling becomes ritual, and curiosity becomes sacrifice. One night, Claire disappeared from her bed. No signs of a break-in, no goodbye. But her diary remained open. The final page read, "She called me by name. Not to punish, not to kill, but to remember her. Because the moment we forget, she becomes something else." A month later, a podcast episode titled The Fifth Habit Theory went viral. It pieced together everything. Anna's disappearance, Claire's visions, Evelyn's sealed envelope. But what caught listeners off guard wasn't the retelling. It was the sound clip played at the end. A short, 3-second recording uploaded anonymously. 6 tones. Soft, echoing like bells underwater. Thousands commented immediately, many joking at first, until reports surfaced of shared dreams among listeners that very night. Dreams of walking in sunflower fields under black skies, of voices humming just out of reach, of a chapel built beneath the roots of a tree older than the town itself. And in each dream, always the same feeling. You've heard too much to walk away now. Mark, still searching for Anna, heard about the podcast and listened to it in full. That night, he dreamt of her standing in a well-lit room beneath the ground, surrounded by figures in faded habits. Her eyes glowed like embers, and her voice, when she spoke, was not her own. "It's not me you need to save," she said. "It's what I'm holding back." The next morning, he drove to the ruins again, this time bringing a shovel. He dug where the habit had once lain, and 3 feet down, he found something wrapped in wax cloth. A hymnal. Her father's. The one believed to have burned. Inside, every page was blank, except the last. One line, "You are the 7th." Mark didn't know what it meant, but he felt it deep in his bones. A roll passed like a curse, a burden that couldn't be dropped, only delayed. And it was his turn now. Mark started seeing her everywhere, in the corner of mirrors, in reflections on dark windows. Not Anna, as he remembered her, but the figure from the dreams. Veiled, still, watching. The townspeople whispered again. Strange noises at night. Fields where nothing grew. Children waking up screaming the same word. 7. He began to collect the stories. From forums, podcasts, old journals. The pieces connected, not like a puzzle, but like a map. One made from memory, ritual, and grief. And at the center of it all, the barn. Or rather, what had once been the barn. He returned to the field, dug deeper this time, and he found stairs, carved into stone, leading beneath the earth. He descended with nothing but a flashlight and the hymnal. The air grew colder with every step, until breath became fog, and time seemed to slow. At the bottom, he found the chapel. Not imagined, not symbolic, real, intact, candles lit without flame, a stone altar, and on it, 7 habits folded in a row. He placed the hymnal gently beside them, and whispered, "If it's me, then take me." The silence that followed was total, deafening, like the world had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. Then a bell rang. Once, then again, and a third time. But no darkness came. No figure emerged. Only the faintest voice, echoing from the stone, "Not yet. The 8th must come willingly." Mark climbed back up the stairs, carrying the weight of 7 forgotten names. But he knew now, this story would not end with him, because someone, somewhere, was already dreaming of sunflowers. The podcast disappeared 3 days later. All audio wiped. The forum threads archived. The original files couldn't be recovered, even by data experts. Accounts were deactivated, users vanished, and the site's administrator issued a vague statement. Due to psychological risks and repeated complaints, all material related to the 5th habit has been removed indefinitely. But the silence came too late. The dreams didn't stop. In cities across the country, unrelated strangers began reporting the same vision. An underground chapel, 7 veils, and an 8th space empty, waiting. Therapists began noticing patterns. Artists painted sunflower fields drenched in shadow. Children hummed lullabies in unison, without ever having met. And in every corner of these stories, there was always one thread. Someone had remembered what was meant to be forgotten. Mark stopped leaving his house. He boarded the windows, removed all mirrors, and burned every book that even resembled scripture. He wasn't protecting himself. He was trying to protect them. His children, now teenagers, had started drawing again. First with crayons, then with ash. Always the same image, a barn with no doors, a field with 7 figures, and above it all, a black sun. He knew what was coming. The 8th wasn't a person. It was a generation. The memory had infected the world like a virus, spreading through curiosity, fascination, and belief. It no longer needed veils, habits, or hymns. It had evolved. It had become story. Years passed. The barn was eventually rebuilt as a museum, though no one knew who funded it. The tour guide spoke vaguely about local folklore, emphasizing the legend but never the names. The 7th habit was placed in a glass case, untouched. A plaque beneath read, "Don't speak. Don't remember. Just witness." Few understood what it meant. Few were asked. But every year, on the same night in late spring, the sunflowers bloom early, only in that field. No one plants them. No one maintains them. They grow in perfect rows, 7 wide. And every morning after, the museum's lights flicker precisely at 3:13 a.m. One night, a young girl wandered from her school group during a tour. She walked straight to the case, stared at the habit for several minutes. When the guide found her, she was humming, softly, precisely in tune. "What's that song?" he asked gently. She turned slowly, a calm smile on her face. "It's not a song," she replied. "It's a name." And, just like that, the cycle began again. Because stories don't end. They transform. And some vanishings aren't tragedies. They are invitations. Some stories are never meant to be understood. They're meant to be felt. Through the silence between words. Through the shiver down the spine when something resonates a little too deeply. The tale of the 4 vanished nuns, the field of sunflowers, the hidden chapel, and the people who followed the thread. It was never just about mystery. It was about memory, how the past echoes, not in books or news articles, but in dreams, rituals, and the things we fear to speak aloud. This story, though wrapped in fiction and shadow, whispers a truth we often ignore. Some wounds don't bleed, they echo. Some voices are not loud, but eternal. And when generations carry silence instead of healing, the silence becomes heavier than the truth itself. In trying to forget, the people in this story open the very path for remembrance to return. Louder, stranger, more unstoppable than ever. You might wonder now, was any of it real? The barn? The hymnal? The veils? Maybe that's not the right question. Because the most dangerous stories are the ones that make you feel like they could be. The ones that leave a shape in your thoughts, even after the screen fades to black. And if tonight, a song plays faintly in the distance, or if you dream of sunflowers that were never planted, don't panic. It just means the story found you too. Let this be a reminder. The line between legend and legacy is often just who dares to remember. And maybe, just maybe, the truest horror isn't what hides in darkness, but what we awaken through our curiosity. By listening, by retelling, by believing just long enough to make the story breathe again. And if this story held your breath for even a few seconds longer than expected, then stay close. Subscribe so you don't miss the next name whispered from the dark. Like the video to help it find others who are still listening. And share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the best way to close a veil is by opening a conversation.